Um, thank you all so much for coming to AEFP 2021. I have been just blown away by the engagement and the enthusiasm from all of our members and participants. I've been to a session in nearly every time slot, and every single one has been awesome. And interesting papers, great presentations, good discussions. So thank you all so much. Before we kick off today's general session, I do want to ask that we take a moment of silence and reflect on the horrendous hate crimes against Asian American and Asian communities in this country. Thank you. Looking around this conference, I am constantly reminded that we are stronger because of our diversity. We continue to work towards becoming a more inclusive and welcoming association here at AEFP, and I know that we have room to grow. Please always reach out to us with ideas or concerns. So with that, we will start our general session. I would be really remiss to do so without a huge thank you to the amazing program committee who worked incredibly hard during an incredibly difficult year to make sure this conference is engaging and exciting, even over Zoom. So you can see all the people whose hard work went into it. And a massive thank you to Patrice Ayatarola, AEFP's president, who has led the organization through some incredibly difficult and complex choices this year. I have very big shoes to fill. And with that, Patrice.
Thank you, Catherine. And I will just start off by thanking you for your amazing leadership, your vision for this conference, your ability to carry it through, and the incredible energy and passion that you bring to every endeavor. To Lydia, folks, we have been blessed with outstanding executive directors, and Lydia is a noteworthy successor thrown into the fire last year with less than a year in the position to take our in-person conference virtual in 8 days to this year, absolutely taking us to new levels. She has been a very special partner in our work for the association. To Heap Ho, the quiet one, climbing mountains and meeting every challenge we put in front of them. To our newcomer, Jackie Glosson, AFP intern extraordinaire. And with that, I'd like to recognize a very special executive director that we lost this past year, George Babagan, and just truly special. May his memory be for blessing as he is reunited with his wife, Nancy, indelibly by his side. I'd like to thank our conference sponsors and just simply say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you. To our outgoing board members who have given tirelessly to AEFP, your contributions have been meaningful. To Kara Jackson, Mark Long, Abigail Payne, Leslie Turner, Marty West. We'll miss you on the board, but look forward to engaging you as members. And thank you to our continuing board members. Between this year and last year in the virtual conference, you've given incredible amounts of time and your service is greatly appreciated. And I just wanted to say we're excited to have our second cohort of pre-doctoral fellows, thanks to Kara Jackson, chair of the membership committee, for organizing that group. And with that, I'll turn it over to Abigail.
Great, thank you, Patrice. So good morning, folks. I know it's evening there, but I'm talking to you from Melbourne, the wonders of Zoom. So it was my pleasure this year to serve for a second year as chair of the nominations committee, in which our remit is to propose a slate to the entire board of potential candidates to serve on the next cohort of board of directors. So I'd like to walk through with you these candidates. I will do it very quickly. You will have seen an email come through. Please vote. I'd like to say vote often, but you only get to vote once. But please vote. For most of our positions, there are twice the number of candidates as there are positions. And I can tell you from experience that it is often the case where the candidates who win by one vote. So your vote in this case, it does count a lot. So please make sure you vote. So first up is our president-elect. This is the one position in which there is one candidate serving. And the board unanimously agreed to the candidate of Professor Jason Grissom, who is a professor of public policy and education at the Peabody College of Education and Human Development. Jason has been a regular member of AEFP, and he served on the board from 2015 to 2018. His research covers a range of topics that includes political science, public administration, and economics, with perspectives to understand issues pertaining to school and school district leadership, educator mobility, and educational equity. So please make sure, even though he's the only candidate, to show him our enthusiastic support of President-elect. The next round of candidates, next slide, please, are at-large candidates. There are 6 candidates for 3 positions. I hope that what you will note, just as we did last year and every other year, is that what we try to do is we try to identify candidates that represent age, diversity, longstanding members of AEFP in terms of coming to our conferences and membership. So these are all fantastic candidates. And a reminder, only 3 get elected. Next slide, please. In addition to our at-large candidates, we have a range of special positions on the board of directors. This year, we have 2 that are up for election. The first one is our international candidate. So this is going to be the person that replaces me. So we have 2 great candidates, one from Canada, one from Europe. So please look at their bios and vote for them. And then we also have 2 government candidates, one from Gwinnett County is Georgia, I think, and one from Kentucky. So again, these are all fantastic candidates. I am indebted to the nominations committee for coming up with a great slate, and indebted to all of the candidates who have agreed to participate and be selected for nomination. So again, please vote. There's an email, you just have to click. We've made it very easy for you. And let me just say good luck to all of the candidates. Thank you.
Stephanie, you're up.
Hi, everyone. I can't seem to start a video, but that's okay. Hi. I am delighted to be here today with Randy Rebeck, who's also on, to present the awards for education, finance, and policy. Before we announce the awards, Randy and I just want to send a huge thank you to our amazing team of associate editors and Maya Esqueda, our editorial assistant, who worked tirelessly to keep the journal going through this challenging year. Now to our first award. It is my pleasure to announce that this year's winner of the Thomas A. Downs Award for Best Paper is Beth Schuler at the University of Virginia. Her paper, Making the Most of School Vacation, a field experiment of small group math instruction, shows that a one-week math vacation academy can have large impacts on achievement at a low cost. This intervention seems particularly promising as schools look for cost-effective ways to close achievement gaps in the wake of the pandemic. Now I'll turn it over to Randy for our next award.
Thank you, Stephanie. And as Steph thanked our associate editors, I'd like to thank all of our excellent reviewers and especially our editorial board for helping us with so many great reviews. Good reviews are thorough and well organized with numbered comments, and also say all their major points with a kind tone without losing any substance. And that was certainly true of our second annual Anonymous Reviewer Award winner, who will be Daniel Mangram from the New York Federal Reserve. Congratulations to Daniel. You are no longer anonymous. And thank you so much for your excellent work. And we again thank the countless other reviewers who have helped us. You're so important to the quality of the journal. Thank you.
Hey, I think that it is, I'm up now to recognize this year's winners of our AEFP awards. And I also would like to thank the awards committee who had the task of reviewing just a tremendous body of work from a number of excellent candidates. It's a really outstanding application pool. So thank you for everybody who nominated, colleagues who submitted, for letting us see a really excellent body of work. Our first set of awards is going to be our New Scholar Awards. We have 2 winners that are being recognized as new scholars. If we can get the next slide. Our first is Danielle Sanderson Edwards from Michigan State University. And Danielle's project will use a rich set of enrollment, achievement, address, and transportation provision data to look at different sets of Michigan public school students and determine how a transportation provision affects student attendance and achievement, and whether there are differences based on different student characteristics. Congratulations to Danielle. Our second winner is Lena Shi from Harvard University. And Lena's project is going to conduct an experiment with a set of community colleges to evaluate whether providing different types of information can help to support community college students as they make decisions about whether and where to transfer to four-year colleges. So our congratulations to both of these excellent young scholars, and we of course look forward to seeing them present this work at future AEFP conferences, hopefully in person. Next slide, please. The winner of the Jean Flanagan Dissertation Award this year is Christine Mulhern. She earned her PhD at Harvard in public policy and is now an associate policy researcher at RAND Corporation. Her dissertation was titled Personalized Information and College Choices, the Role of School Counselors, Technology, and Siblings. And the dissertation was praised by the committee, the awards committee, for its creative and rigorous approach to studying the role of a wide variety of little studied sources of information that students may draw on when they're considering their college attendance options. So in her first chapter, Christine looks at the role of Naviance, a software program that provides students with information on the admissions records of different students from their same high schools at different colleges. And she leverages several quirks of the software that may influence the information that students receive and the signals that they take from it. And she finds that students are responsive to the information that's provided along a number of different dimensions. And this suggests a really important role for information providing software. And she gives a very thoughtful analysis around ways that the software design may potentially produce unintended consequences that designers should consider as well. Her second and third chapters likewise leverage quasi-random assignment to different sources of information based on assignment policies to school counselors and college outcomes of siblings that she argues may influence the level of information that students receive as they are navigating their college choice decisions. And just an extremely creative and very well done set of papers. And so we congratulate Christine, and again, look forward to seeing this work play out in the future. Next slide, please. We also have a set of honorable mentions for the Flanagan Dissertation Award this year. So our first honorable mention goes to Riley Acton, who got her PhD from Michigan State University and is now an assistant professor at Miami University. Riley's dissertation uses quasi-experimental methods to tackle a number of different questions in the economics of education. Her first 2 papers take creative approaches towards estimating the effects of tuition prices on community college enrollment and the way that job losses in local communities affect community college enrollment in different programs. Her third paper contributes to the K-12 literature, looking at how changes in state health insurance mandates affected educational services and outcomes for students with autism spectrum disorder. Congratulations to Riley. And our second honorable mention goes to Camilla Morales, who earned her PhD from Georgia State University and is now an assistant professor at the University of Texas in Dallas. Camilla's dissertation consists of a cohesive set of essays looking at immigration and refugee policies and language practices at schools. Her first essay looks at spillover effects on native-born children of exposure to political refugees and finds heterogeneous effects on native-born children based on their prior achievements. Her second and third essays look at different aspects of language policy, ESL services, and dual language immersion programs respectively, to uncover informative effects about children's exposure to different instructional approaches to language acquisition. So congratulations to all 3 of these award winners of the Dissertation Award. Next slide, please. Our early career award this year goes to Dominique Baker of Southern Methodist University. Dominique is an assistant professor of education policy at SMU and received her PhD from Vanderbilt in 2016. Her research focuses on higher education policy and practices, and in particular, she explores how the design and implementation of policies and practices can influence inequity in higher education outcomes. Her work touches on a number of different areas of higher education policy, including student financial aid, affirmative action and college admissions practices, and college climates and the extent to which those foster inclusive and equitable environments. The awards committee noted both the policy relevance and the rigor of Dominique's work, as well as her commitment to outreach to public audiences. This includes both an impressive record of writing broadly accessible pieces for public consumption, as well as engagement with policymakers at the state and federal levels to help guide thoughtful approaches to higher education policies. Her early career trajectory promises a continued record of engaged and policy relevant scholarship, and we congratulate Dominique on this award. Last slide, please. Our last award is a brand new award, and we would like to thank the Center for University Excellence at American University for supporting a brand new award joint with AEFP in Applied Higher Education Finance and Policy. Our inaugural winner of this award is Sue Donarski from the University of Michigan. Sue is a professor of public policy, education, and economics at the University of Michigan, and it is frankly rather difficult to be concise when summarizing the influence of Sue's research on higher education policy. Her body of research on higher education spans a range of different policies and practices, including pioneering work on financial aid simplification, designs of student loan repayment systems, and recently the design of a campaign to provide clear and digestible information on projected financial aid receipt to students through the Michigan Hale Scholarship Program. Her work also looks at how pre-college experiences such as high school curriculum, dual enrollment, even elementary school class size affect students' post-secondary outcomes. In addition to a truly stellar record of academic publications, Sue has consistently reached out to broader audiences, both to disseminate her own findings and to highlight important findings in the broader field of higher education policy research. She publishes regularly in outlets like the Upshot column in the New York Times, the Evidence Speaks series to the Brookings Institution. Sue's rigorous and engaged scholarship truly serves as a model for the kind of work that AEFP researchers strive for. So Sue, congratulations on being named the inaugural recipient of this award. We congratulate again all of the recipients of our awards, and I'm going to turn it over to Tom Downs for service awards.
So Lydia, can you hold on this slide for a second? The immediate past president of AEFP, and that's me, has few responsibilities other than getting in the way of the rest of the executive committee and the board and choosing the winner of this award. And it's choosing the winner of this award that is the best part of the job, because it is really rare to have the chance to honor and thank someone who has contributed so much to this profession, this organization. For those of you who don't know, the Outstanding Service Award is meant to honor someone for their contributions made to public policy development, research, public understanding, local school finance development, and service to the AEFP. Usually the winners of the award excel in one of those realms. I think this year's winner excels in all. The award winner, this year's award winner, and I share the fact that much of our early academic work focused on school finance in California. But this person was far more precocious than me, becoming a president of AEFP relatively early in his career. As president and then past president, this person has worked tirelessly to strengthen this organization and to be a friend and mentor to numerous scholars. On the policy side, according to his bio, he has consulted extensively on school finance issues in more than 20 states. But I think that understates the role he has played in influencing the design of school finance systems across the country. Part of his influence on design has been through research. Part has been through his much used and cited textbook, and part has come from his ability to make challenging concepts understandable to students and policymakers. This is someone who ticks all of the boxes for this award. And for all that, I think everyone who knows this award winner knows how generous he is, how self-effacing he is, how good-humored he is, and how much of a treat it is to share a ride to the airport with him. I am so glad that I have the honor, Lydia, change the slide now, to give this Outstanding Service Award to Larry Pikus. Larry, long deserved. Thanks to everything you've done. Next slide. Those of you who took part in last night's trivia heard Angie Hall, our former executive director, note that Bob Gertz had mentored her in her first years in the role of executive director. I think all of us who have had a chance to work with Bob would echo Angie's sentiments. We have depended on Bob, not just for his tremendous work on budgets, but for everything he's done to make this organization work well. When Bob stepped into the position of treasurer, AEFP was in a challenging position financially. Bob steps away with AEFP on tremendously solid footing. And I don't throw around tremendously easily. We are in great shape. And that is to a great extent due to Bob. And yet, even as Bob has kept a careful eye on our spending, he has been central to so many of our innovative programs over the last decade. Bob has helped push us forward while also being our institutional memory, reminding us of where we have been as an organization and of what our mission is. We have a great successor for Bob and Richard Bowman, but board meetings won't be the same without Bob. And personally, I'm going to miss the chance to catch up with Bob each month in our executive committee meetings. Though I guess what's going to have to happen now is that Bob and I, since we're both off the board, will have to do our catching up at baseball games, maybe in conjunction with or separate from these conferences. Thanks, Bob, for everything you've done for AEFP. And here's hoping that this summer you've got some really well-deserved time in the stands. So thank you, Bob. With that, I want to turn the screen back over to Patrice for her presidential address.
Hi, all. So we started with a moment of silence, and I just want to add to that moment of silence and maybe won't take a full minute to be silent, to go beyond ourselves, to quiet our mind, our nerves. Okay, that's for me, but to find transcendence. I'd like to start off with acknowledgements, or to continue the acknowledgements that I started earlier. It's incredible to follow in a line of AEFP presidents that I have so respected, and it's fitting that I follow on the heels of Tom Downs, of Downs and Pogue, which was just seminal research for me in my dissertation, in my graduate studies. Many institutions and units, including mine at FSU, have developed land acknowledgements to recognize, we can go back to the other slide, to recognize and heal the scarred history of our educational institutions and the land upon which they sit that in so many cases belong to our indigenous nations and our institutions built with slave labor. While we're on virtual land, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the shoulders upon which I stand. In the early 1900s, my maternal great-grandmother came to America from Serbia, leaving behind her young children, including my grandmother, and her husband to seek out means to support her family, which she did in the company towns of the Midwestern rock quarries. Running a boarding house, my grandmother, who came as a 7-year-old to this country, toiled in a factory and struggled with the harshness of life, raising 5 children on her own. She and my mom, my aunts and uncles literally lived next to the railroad tracks. Education at the high school level was their means of economic and social ascent. My parents, my dad, who worked tirelessly as a grocery store owner and a butcher, I have his apron hanging on my door, to support his 8 children who were literally above his head. We lived above the store. My mother, who loves to read and values education, we take it from her. While I may technically be a first-gen student, as the 7th of 8 children, I saw older cousins and siblings going off to college. The earliest and most vivid impression of college came from my oldest sister, who was celebrated by our extended family for going off to college, and later a visit to her dorm room, where to this day, more than 40 years later, I can vividly remember the sights, especially of the vending machine in the dorm, the thought that sealed college for me. The vending machines had chocolate milk, thus I can have chocolate milk whenever I wanted if I went to college. My second oldest sister by my side during my freshman year in college, running stadium stairs with me and treating me to a bagel with cream cheese. There was no freshman 15 with her by my side. And to my third oldest sister, lending me insight on how I might think and to go about exploring schools to transfer to after a year at Arizona. Next slide. Thank you to my beautiful mom and my dad of blessed memory for the inheritance of the love of education you provided us, to us and your grandchildren. Next slide. The academic and professionals, before I get to the year, the academic and professional shoulders are many, but to name just a few: captains of the NYU crew, Leanna Stiefel and Amy Ellen Schwartz; my FSU team, my chairs, Carolyn Harrington, who hired me, and Motoko Akiba, who leads me and has sponsored this general session. Thank you. The year, what a year. From virtual to virtual, me in a leadership position that can only be attributed to divine providence. As I traveled to DC in February 2020, aware and unaware at the same time of the virus, with COVID-19 dramatically altering our lives and the landscape around it shortly thereafter. Sitting in my car in Jacksonville for the Jewish holiday of Purim, for the executive committee meeting to discuss canceling our Dallas in-person conference, which the board shortly thereafter voted to do. Lydia Ross, as I mentioned before, and HEPO pulling off a virtual conference 8 days later. As we are all learning, all is seen and heard, none more disturbingly than the murder of George Floyd, which unfortunately is only one of so many cases. The constant attacks on our senses and sensibilities that culminated in an attack on our nation's capital, the bedrock of our democracy. And then, just on Tuesday, the Asian hate-filled murders of 6 Asian women, American women, that took the lives of 2 others as well. This year, message after message from AEFP to reassure ourselves and our members that there is good in this world and that we are committed to challenging ourselves and our association to end racism, to embrace diversity, to value inclusion, and to live equitably. What we put into this world shapes it, and I'm so proud of what AEFP in its current form and past form of AEFA has put into this world. This is a special association, and as we carve our path, we lead and need your help as we move from thoughts and words to actions. Next slide. The goals of the talk, okay, about halfway in, almost. Certainly modest, but of import. much of what we know or do already, but always helpful to remember where we have been, where we are at, and where we would like to go. So I'd like to get us to think about knowledge, see how perspectives shape knowledge, value perspectives, and building a scholarly home. So in terms of knowledge starts with a flash of insight, the flash coming from experience, from observation, from the work of others, from casual conversations, wherever. Taking that flash of insight and developing it, deepening it through study, investigation, analysis, contemplation, vetting, reconciling, presenting, feedback, revising, and refining to the state of knowing, to having knowledge. Knowledge is not static. It represents our best understanding of a phenomenon at any given moment. Knowledge grows, it sharpens, it deepens, it overturns. Knowledge is shaped by perspective in meaningful ways. Next slide. An illustrative example. Our orientation on school finance equity and education research shifts as available data and technology evolve, from state and district level data, predating even the old floppies, to school level data and student level data as our technological capacity grew. One slide back, still, yeah. Our questions evolved as well, moving closer and closer to what matters, moving from the state to the district, to the school, to the student. In the illustrative example, we moved from knowing how much districts spent and the object and function of the spending to knowing what was being spent at the school level, with cost accounting attributing district level spending to the school level. New York City actually led the way on this with their school budget reports that I used in my dissertation decades ago now, to knowing what resources in the form of the most important resource of all, teachers, matched to kids. Longitudinal data systems integrated and matched with other information systems on labor market earnings, social welfare systems, etc. Not to be outdone, qualitative data has gone big. But it's not simply a matter of data, but most certainly aided by data. We bring disciplinary perspectives, methodological approaches, lest we think that positionality is simply a matter for the researchers among us who use qualitative approaches. It applies to all of us. The theories we rely upon, the methods we use, the questions we ask, all reflect our positionality, positions. Throughout our history, we've had different mixes of academic researchers, think tanks, practitioners, intermediary organizations, students. The sustained efforts of building and growing research practice partnerships, spurred in part by IES funding opportunities, but also spurred by those within state and districts organizations. Incredibly important to our organization. No two people are the same. Next slide. Sorry. No two people are the same. No 2 points on this color spectrum are the same. Yet every point in every individual is necessary and essential part of the whole, and the richness and the full color of the whole. A whole that doesn't recognize and value its parts is not truly a whole. A part that does not recognize the other cannot be united in the whole. Dimensions on which we identify ourselves personally, professionally, seeing ourselves as a whole. E pluribus unum, out of the many, one. Scholarly home. Next slide. Building that home. Building that home, we want to improve policy and practice, making lives better. This is the mission. And we want to bridge the gap between research and practice. We have made great strides here at AEFP, and it is so exciting to palpably see this. Carrie Conaway's leadership took us to another level, and the Walton Family Foundation support has been so critical in this. Our challenge now is to sustain this, to grow it, and see the impact on the ground level in schools and classroom. We have a ways to go. School and institutional professionals across early childhood, PK to 12, post-secondary, are looking to improve education for all, and we are in a position as educators ourselves and as researchers to help them develop the skills to embed it on the ground. I was struck by a student's defense of her dissertation in practice this past Monday. A student advised by my colleague, Stacy Rutledge, and a student who had extensive teaching experience, administrative experience at district and state levels, working now for the Southeast REL. What was most striking for her in her study of literacy interventions in middle schools, the huge gap between research and practice. So there's more work, and we're a central part of that work. Also, building our scholarly home to go beyond ourselves. There's comfort in connection. There's no doubt trade-offs between the concentration and clustering of like-minded, like-trained, like folks. It's fun, it's comfortable, we know the language spoken, but it's also isolating, siloing, and stunts meaningful growth. I want to challenge ourselves. We need to challenge ourselves with new perspectives, to step outside and see this richly hued world. As leadership, as stewards of it, and to serve you, well, not simply messaging. It's our priority to be an organization where we all can be our truest and best selves, bringing our unique skills and perspectives to help us to understand the world of education and to make it better. You, our members, are our partners to pitch in wherever necessary, to hold us accountable. I look forward to working with Catherine and Jason in the year ahead to continue to take steps forward. AEFP is my home. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We are running a couple minutes early, so that's exciting. So I'm going to start with the introduction for the keynote, and I'm hoping that all of our keynote panelists will be on by the time I finish. So when I started planning this conference, I had this idea for a keynote, which was that we could benefit from multiple perspectives about what I believe is one of the most fundamental issues facing education and education policy today: the right to not just a basic education, but the right to a good education. The Gary B case encapsulates the fight for this fundamental right, the right to read. So it is my pleasure and absolute honor to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Jamarie Hall, who's one of the student plaintiffs in the case. We also have Mark Rosenbaum, who is the lead counsel arguing the case on behalf of Jamarie and all of his fellow students in Detroit and around the country. Dr. Elizabeth Moji, who is professor of literacy and the dean of the University of Michigan College of Education and an expert on the topic. Dr. Nikolai Vitti, the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Community District and one of the most outspoken leaders advocating for social justice in K-12 education I've ever known. And Christine Bowman, professor of education policy and law at Michigan State University, who wrote one of the amicus briefs for the case. Professor Bowman will be moderating the panel. And Christine, why don't you kick us off? I don't know if everybody is quite here yet, so maybe you can start with your background and we'll make sure everyone can join in.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. And I have the honor of starting us off with an overview of this case. So as many of you know, the 1973 Supreme Court decision, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, meant that school finance litigation, including litigation about a right to education, has occurred almost entirely in state courts for 50 years. Now, in some states, these cases have been active for decades, like in Kansas, but not so in Michigan. So around 2010 or so, the Michigan ACLU and Mr. Rosenbaum were trying to figure out how to use the courts to contest educational disparities in Michigan. Their first attempt was a case in state court, but that case was over almost before it began. However, the poor conditions and injustices in so many Michigan schools remained. So attorneys and activists regrouped and decided to focus on a slightly different problem in one specific city, Detroit. Building on the courage of plaintiffs, including Mr. Hall, and with the legal savvy of Mr. Rosenbaum and his team, in 2016, they sued the state of Michigan, claiming that students in traditional public and charter schools in Detroit had been denied their federal constitutional right to literacy. This case is one of a small handful of innovative education cases occurring across the country in recent years. But these cases aren't just creative. They also qualify as impact litigation. In other words, they're cases designed to change the law in a significant way and ultimately to change society. Now, the case Gary B. never went to trial, but it had an interesting journey nonetheless. Right after the case was filed, the state pushed back, asking the court to dismiss the case because there was no such thing as a right to literacy. And in the most literal sense, this was true. There is no right to literacy or to education written in the federal Constitution, but a lot of fundamental federal rights aren't written. And so there was room for Mr. Rosenbaum and his team to make the case that a right to literacy did exist. So the parties and many amicus, friends of the court, filed briefs about this issue. And eventually, the federal trial court agreed with the state and dismissed the case. Now, by that point, this case was the subject of national attention. Plaintiffs appealed, and on appeal, they won. In a monumental decision, federal appeals judge Clay wrote, "Without the literacy provided by a basic minimum education, it is impossible to participate in our democracy. We recognize that the Constitution provides a fundamental right to a basic minimum education." The focus of the litigation up to this point was about whether a right to literacy existed, because if a right doesn't exist, it can't be violated. Now that the appeals court had settled the first question, plaintiffs could go back to the trial court and try to prove their case, that the right, which now existed, had been violated. Now, most cases that go to court settle, so it was not surprising that the parties entered serious discussion about settlement at this point. They came to an agreement, and at the same time, the federal appeals court rescinded its earlier decision in favor of the plaintiffs in a very unusual procedural move. The parties' settlement consisted of a few key terms. First, the state provided nearly $300,000 for the 7 plaintiffs to use for their education. Second, the state provided nearly $3 million to Detroit Public Schools Community District for literacy-related supports. Third, the state promised accountability and support through various task forces and committees. Last, but certainly not least, the governor also promised to introduce legislation to provide Detroit Public Schools Community District with $94.4 million in funding for literacy programs. And just this past Monday, Michigan lawmakers introduced a bill to that effect. Now, those of you who followed the case know that watching it from the outside felt like riding a roller coaster. Our panelists know what it felt like from the inside, though, and I'm glad to be able to turn to them now. So the first question is for all of our panelists. Impact litigation, like the Gary B. case, tries to solve a big problem. So what is or was that problem, and how did we get to a point where this case was necessary in Michigan? Mr. Hall, will turn to you for our first response.
Thank you so much for you all being here today and for having me a part of today's panel and keynote conference. But it's the battle for liberation, for justice, for freedom, for equality, for opportunity. The 14th Amendment is cited in more litigation than any other amendment. So seeing that we are fighting for liberty, freedom, justice for all, we have been oppressed by not being allowed to be educated onto sharecroppers education. And today, it is our second-class citizenship of education that we are receiving with the education curriculum that we are learning, onto the funding, onto the control over our schools. The paradox of education is precisely that one begins to become conscious one begins to examine the society in which they are being educated. So I'm going to need you all to just imagine with me for a while and take a walk. Like, imagine that there's a student in a low income family who barely has a place to sleep, barely has food to eat, and knowing that education is the key to change their circumstance. And then going to a school with inhumane, unsanitary conditions, harsh temperatures, worst of all, no resources. I ask you, what is the student to do? When school is like a juvenile detention center, from the neglected, crumbling brick foundation onto the metal detectors and security at doors, to the windows and doors throughout the school being chained and bolted, to the windows having bars on them, black mold throughout the facility. When water fountains are out of order, bathrooms are unusable, no stalls, no doors, to be able to be comfortable to learn in an environment that's supposed to get you out of your predicament that you're going through. When schools are being closed, teachers are getting pay cuts, classes and school programs for students are being stripped away. Meanwhile, there are jails and casinos being built not even a mile away from your school. While lack of equitable funding, resources, closing of schools, often changing methods of educating the children, often stealing funds, maintaining the school to prison pipeline, just unjust student codes, not allowing predominantly minority communities to be in charge of their education, to not have these communities to have an elected school board. All these are battles in a war for the demise of public education, which me and my fellow students were victims of in our communities and our parents. The gentrification, and all led by governors such as John Engler, Jennifer Graham, Rick Snyder, with reform boards, the School of Choice Act, appointed emergency management, such as Robert Bob and Daniel Early, who was also made the last final decision on the Flint water crisis, with bills being passed such as 436 and Bill PA 436, where we cannot have elected school boards in our communities, acts and laws and bills that were voted down by the community, by the parents, by the teachers. And all while schools are closing. The death of a school and the death of a person by a barrel are not the same, but in the form they are. When schools are closing, the communities that are being affected and that are closing, that the schools are closing in, is being affected as well, with blight, with low income, with high crime rates, with high birth rates, with low income. So these are all forms that are not just hindering the students, but are hindering us as citizens, as a nation. And it is something that the failure to provide an equitable education for all helps to maintain a racial and broken caste system that hinders citizens from liberty and threatens our democracy. Democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice and vote are prepared to choose wisely. Literacy should be understood as a foundation for one of our country's core principles, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, ensuring that all U.S. students graduate from high school prepared to participate fully in our democracy and in civic life. How can we be productive citizens to society without a safe, comfortable opportunity at literacy? Educational opportunity is the civil rights issue of our time. The world has progressed, and over centuries, technology has advanced tremendously. Automobiles have advanced, landscaping has advanced, while classrooms, curriculum, and schools are still the same. School is supposed to help prepare us for the future, or is it the past?
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Now, I'd like to turn to Dean Moji for her thoughts on this. in particular in Michigan, how did we get to a point where the situation, the lived experience that Mr. Hall explained so eloquently, where that happened?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hall. You've said it all, really. You've really shown us the big problem. And the big problem is really due to what I think is an open secret, and that is inequities in funding. So you pointed out, Mr. Hall, the conundrum that is education in our society. We claim it's the great equalizer, but in fact, if we need education to gain access, and we need access to gain education, we have a thorny problem. And that lack of access is due to inequitable funding streams. Now, I know that Dr. Vitti can tell you, in detail, all of the inequities that he experiences every day in thinking about how he's going to fund the schools. But I'm going to just talk about a few particular pieces. So one is access to funding that will supply the very best kinds of texts and tools for our schools in all districts, not only in the districts where those kinds of texts and tools are affordable because the tax base will push in funding on top of the funding that's distributed by the state. That access to high quality text and high quality tools, technology tools, is absolutely critical to really building a literate populace. There's another piece of this though, and that's access to high quality curriculum, to curricula that can be place-based and project-based, that can engage children and youth in meaningful learning. And when districts are not equitably funded, they simply can't afford to get the most cutting edge curricula, to be able to use those curricula in really powerful ways. They can't provide the professional development that they need, and they can't address the kinds of inequities that have already occurred and the kinds of learning challenges that children face. And then finally, I would say there's an inequitable funding issue that revolves around teachers and teacher preparation. I just finished teaching a class where someone asked about whether we could think about placing teachers equitably, which is an interesting concept. But the reality is we need to be able to ensure that all districts can recruit the most powerful and prepared teachers. And teacher preparation is absolutely critical in this work. And as we think about funding and we think about the challenges that districts that have been underfunded are facing, we have to ask that question about how we incentivize and support teachers in districts that are underfunded. Where do the resources come from? How do we help to continuously develop our teachers? We know that teachers are the most important professionals in our society because they, of course, touch every profession, and yet they are the most underfunded in our society. We have to figure that funding inequity out.
Thank you. Dr. Vitti, the lawsuit may have predated your time in Michigan, but is there anything you'd like to add to help us build out this context of how we came to be in this situation?
Sure. Thank you for having me on the panel. I would echo what Dean Moji said as well, that Mr. Hall nailed it on the head with just explaining his experience and what that felt like. I don't think anyone can listen to that and not clearly get a better understanding of the reality that race plays in this conversation and socioeconomics. So I don't want to repeat what he or what Dean Moji said, but the only thing that I would add is I had the unfortunate experience of probably seeing at the ground level the infamy of emergency management. Coming in as the first appointed superintendent, after over a decade of emergency management with the newly elected board. It was my job to come in and start building the systems and processes that were inadequate. And to this day, I think back to that, and there's still examples of that legacy that I'm still trying to work through, but just saddened, angry at what I came into. Having worked in some of the best large urban school districts in the country, like New York and Miami, even Jacksonville, which was considered the lowest performing large urban school district in Florida when I became superintendent. Just so much more of an advancement with systems and processes and infrastructure. Even a district that was considered the lowest performing large urban district in Florida was so much more advanced than Detroit was. And that's all a reflection of what children did not receive, as Mr. Hall said, as far as traditional public education is concerned. Traditional public education, when done the right way, is one of the only vehicles in this country for equal opportunity, for racial justice. And when that system is disinvested, not properly led, without a local accountability structure, it doesn't do what it is built to do. And so, I often go back to this example of being at the Mackinac Center, conference and being asked, and unexpectedly, you have all these legislators in a room. What would you say to them if you were speaking on the behalf of children in Detroit? And I didn't know that question was coming, and I refer back to it because I'll say it now. Is my answer to that question is, our kids want what your kids want. Our kids want the best, infrastructure. They want laptops in their classroom. They want certified, experienced, passionate teachers. They want curriculum that's at grade level. They want schools that have windows that open, heat that doesn't turn off, air conditioning for summer school, football fields without caters in the middle of them, PA systems that work, and I can go on and on. And the reality of why we had the situation that we had in DPS was fundamentally, it was about racism. It was that white governors, white legislature created a system that they would never, ever allow to exist in their own zip codes, in the same neighborhoods that they represented. If anyone ever came up with a system like emergency management and allowed emergency managers that had zero background in education, zero background in educational leadership, zero background in any other education function, and were just bureaucrats appointed, every one of those legislators would demand something different. They would be protesting. And in fact, Detroiters protested. In fact, Detroiters voted against emergency management on a ballot, but it was still imposed. I can't think of anything that is more undemocratic than that. And it is this arrogant, racist thinking that you know better than other people, based on race and based on the history of racism in this country. And I can't think of a better example in the educational setting in the modern era that is more racist than emergency management. I can't. And I've been doing this work for 20 years, always in large urban school districts, always, if you will, in the urban core as a teacher, a principal, superintendent. I'm a history major. I was a history teacher, English language arts teacher. So I have 4 degrees, 3 of which are in education. I've never, ever read or experienced anything like what happened in Detroit under emergency management. And the lawsuit gave voice to students, to parents, to a community that was wronged, and that people, Even people that were linked to the creation of emergency management got away with. There are people in Detroit now that are important, that are relevant, that were part of that process, that get a pass for being a part of that process. And the lawsuit held people accountable. And it will be forever in history when the narrative is written, if it is written, that this lawsuit was connected to it, and the court system held people accountable, at least from a historical perspective. And, you know, that's why it's important. And I know we have more questions, but, you know, it is about socioeconomics. There's no question. It is about inequitable funding, but inherently at the root, it's about racism.
So I'd like to build on that and turn to Mr. Rosenbaum and ask how, as a lawyer, how do you take these facts, right? How do you take these lived experiences and these realities and translate them into a case? That's the first part of the question. And then the second is also if you could help us understand how this case was different than a lot of school finance litigation that had come before.
Well, it's a privilege to be with everyone here, with persons on this panel who had a big part in the litigation and who had a big part in terms of the struggle for educational justice. I also want to, I guess, quadruple what was said in terms of what Jamaria Hall had to say. And when you listen to Jamaria, and I think Jamaria would be the first to tell you, he's not alone on this. This case was propelled by students like him, by visionaries like Dr. Vitti, and supportive advocates like Dean Moji, but it really rode on the shoulders of Jamaria, his counterparts, his other students, his family, his teachers, and a history. I think what is important to recognize in terms of presenting this story is that none of this was an accident. The state of Michigan took the position in this case that these schools, in fact, were schools that met constitutional standards. They said about students like Jamaria, the reason that the literacy rates are so low is, quote, because of the intellectual limitations of the children. That's what they put on their papers. They said it was because there was domestic violence in their families. That's how they defended this. This case didn't start tragically with just emergency managers. This case started with enslaved children when it was a crime to teach them how to read. It started, as Judge Clay pointed out, when the Ku Klux Klan would go after teachers of children of color. It started when there was Jim Crow laws and literacy laws. Look, the inferior opportunities that are afforded children of color throughout the United States is one of the most effective racist policies ever devised to attempt to disenfranchise, to attempt to subordinate groups of color. And that has been the strategy of using public education, as Elizabeth said, not as the great equalizer, but as the great unequalizer. To take individuals like Dr. Vitti, you just have to listen to him speak for 10 seconds and know that he knows how to educate children. He knows how to get them, the children, to the education that they should be delivered, and attempt to block it. And what our lawsuit was about was giving voice to those stories, that historic story, and to say, this is America. This is America that intends to use racism to deny children the opportunity to better their circumstances and to become meaningful participants of a democracy. The case itself, and even after we won the decision from Judge Clay, even when Judge Clay said, look, you can't have democracy, you can't have a 14th Amendment without at least giving children the opportunity to learn to read so that they can read to learn. Literacy is essential in every aspect of democracy. And he talked about how racialized it was. Even after we won the case, as you suggested, Christy, what the Republican legislature did was to run into court and say, this has to be overturned. They didn't. And this case is being utilized throughout the country as a beacon. But they went in and they said, it is too expensive to teach children, that children don't have that right. Although, as Dr. Vitti said, I always thought the constitutional test is an easy one. Would you send your kids to these schools? And if the answer is no, then this has to be changed. So of course we don't have a fair funding system. And of course, I mean, when I last looked at Detroit, the buildings was $1.5 billion just to get them up to basic sanitation conditions. I went into schools where there was an 8th grader teaching classes. 200 teacher vacancies. When I first met Jamarier, he told me he would sit in classes where there were no teachers, periods on end. He had a book bag, and I know he didn't have books to go home. And I said to him, well, what do you use that book bag for? Well, among other sides, besides being a gifted scholar, Jamarier was one hell of a basketball player. And he said, because our gym had no showers. There were rats running around the gymnasium and the place where you would shower. So he would carry an extra set of clothes. That's what he utilized it for. There were picture books in the high schools themselves. So this case is what is necessary 70 years after Brown versus Board Education. The 14th Amendment is 1868 because the political process doesn't care about these kids, and more importantly, wants to make sure that these kids don't vote, that they don't become prosperous, that their communities don't become prosperous, because that's how a caste system works. And that tragically is what the public school system is about today. That's the fight.
Thank you. So turning a bit more to the case itself, can you talk to us about how the case is different from school finance litigation that many in the audience may be familiar with?
Because look, school finance case is necessary, but in 1973, the United States Supreme Court, in one of the most infamous decisions, in my judgment, a case that belongs in the same voice as Dred Scott and as Plessy versus Ferguson, said that there was not a constitutional right to education. That was a school finance case that was brought in Texas. So what we said was, we'll change the metric here. We're not going to talk about money. But those kids in Texas, as pathetic as the disparities were, the United States Supreme Court said they were at least receiving a basic minimal education. And so what we said in this case was, this isn't the Rodriguez case. Even if you want to accept for a moment that there isn't a federal constitutional right of education, which is an obscenity, but even if you want to accept it, there has to be some floor here at which you cannot run a warehouse and say it's a school. You cannot say to children, we're going to put you in a building for 6 to 8 hours a day and not deliver an education without saying at the same time, you don't belong in our democracy. So one difference from this case, one central difference, was to say the federal courts and the federal constitution has to be open to young people like Jamarier Hall to say that they get a fair shot at bettering their circumstances and becoming a part of democracy. Do we need fair funding? Yes. But we need, as you opened up, Christy, to say at the very beginning, a federal right of access to literacy is the right that all other rights are dependent upon. Without a right of access to literacy, all the other ones are really just pretext, just a mockery to make us feel like we're part of a democracy.
So that is a nice segue to Dr. Moji and her expertise. So I'd like to turn back to you, Dean Moji, and ask for your thoughts as a scholar about the case's focus on literacy, especially because the situation and the challenges as we have discussed them are so much broader than literacy.
Thanks, Christine. Well, I have to admit, as a literacy scholar, I tend to think everything is about literacy. But what I want to do is go back to the conundrum that I mentioned, the conundrum we face about education being a route to access, but one needing access to education. And the same is true when we think about literacy. Literacy is a foundation. It's a foundational skill on which all learning rests. And even more important, as we think about the comments we've heard from the panelists, literacy is power. And so if we deny access to literacy, we deny access to power. And so it's no accident that children are denied access to literacy in our nation's schools and in our schools where we know that systemic racism is running rampant. We know that that's actually intentional, it's planful, because if one denies access to literacy, then all future learning is compromised. Children need access to literacy to be able to transform society, to be able to tackle problems of systemic racism, poverty, and other social ills. They need to be leaders in innovating different technology tools to use for social good, not simply for commercial or individual wealth production. They need to be able to elect leaders who are going to challenge the status quo. And so if one can't read, if one can't engage in the democratic process, then one is denied access to power, and those leaders are never changed or challenged. But the problem in this case was really, we really saw it. We saw it in Mr. Hall's comments that children can't learn literacy under the conditions that are described by Mr. Hall, by his student colleagues, and in all of the different briefs that were filed. They can't learn literacy when, first of all, when they don't have books, when they don't have the technology tools they need, when they don't have teachers who are actually taught how to teach literacy at all grade levels, not just in the early grades. They can't learn literacy when they're not loved and respected and cared for. They can't learn literacy when their words and their ways with words are not supported and valued and then built upon. And they can't learn literacy if they're living in the schools in conditions that actually make it virtually impossible to think and engage. And we just see those conditions in the plaintiff's case laid out in striking terms. And it's that it takes us back to funding, which takes us back to systemic racism. And this is all about denying access to power. And that's all about literacy.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Vitti, it would be interesting to hear from you about how this litigation has impacted your work in Detroit Public Schools Community District. And in particular, I want to highlight that the district itself was not a plaintiff or a defendant in the case. And yet the case was all about what was happening in both traditional public and charter schools in Detroit. So a very interesting role to play there.
Well, we, when I became superintendent, even before the lawsuit was moving forward, and I was supportive. I was speaking to Mark about how I could help. And so, when the media reached out to me, or I was asked during community meetings, I said that the literacy lawsuit was important, and it defined the problems of emergency management well, and that there needed to be justice linked to the lawsuit. And whether you're a superintendent, whether you're a principal, whether you're a teacher, this work is heavy. It's hard work, and sometimes that burden is lightened when you have advocates and partners. And throughout the literacy lawsuit and what Mark was saying, what the students and parents were saying, I felt echoed what I was seeing walking into the district. So it didn't. So then I just felt I didn't feel alone, and I'm just being honest. I didn't feel isolated, and I think the lawsuit spoke truth to what I was walking into as the newly appointed superintendent. I think I already mentioned what I think the importance of the lawsuit was from a historical perspective, and it should be a lesson for any state government, any local government who's contemplating on any level that reform looks like that reform will lead to positive improvement if you reduce or restrict local control or local accountability. This should be the case study against that forever. So no matter what, and I mean, someone who's listening who doesn't have context might say, this sounds really political. It's the takeover was political, let's be honest, and straight. But more importantly, you can't look at any indicator and suggest that emergency management moved the district forward in a positive way. So student achievement, you can't say that. From literacy rates, college going rates, graduation rates, financial stability, enrollment, infrastructure of buildings, financial system, everything went backwards. So, the point there, I think moving forward, honestly, the lawsuit has to always be a reminder to a local elected board, myself as superintendent, future superintendents, administrators, and teachers, that there is a legacy linked to not serving children appropriately. And that, I own as superintendent to work every day to fight through the things that exist in the system, outside the system, to do right by children. And that lawsuit has to be a constant reminder of where we were and what we have to do better. And for me, that's what it's about. The near $3 million helps. We're running now interventions for students from kindergarten to 12th grade to try to catch up, who are 2 grade levels below, using Orton Gillingham based interventions for students that are significantly below grade level. And so that helps, but even the $94 million, which I'm skeptical we'll ever receive, that's not it. It's truly being a student's first district. It's being a district that is fighting for equity, and not just saying it, but implementing practices that reflect that. I think that's the importance is, and I think the community should always hold the board, superintendent, leaders, employees accountable to that lawsuit, and remind people what things look like before, and that we are responsible never to replicate that on any level.
So you talked about the legacy of the lawsuit, and so I'd like to give the other panelists an opportunity to weigh in with their thoughts about how they think about the legacy of this particular case. Dean Moji, do you have a comment? Or
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. I was trying to engage in politeness behaviors and see if Mark wanted to jump in first. Yeah, I think that this lawsuit does have a long legacy. Actually, again, just in my class, which Mark was visiting, we talked about the power of the lawsuit and other lawsuits like this, lawsuits around the country. And I think they are as much about holding people accountable, but also shining a bright light on these inequities and really underscoring why the inequities exist and changing the narrative around why they exist. Because the narrative, is one of dysfunction of the district. It's a narrative, as you heard Mark say, that the defendants actually, tried to place the blame on the children and their families. And this kind of lawsuit, and many others that Mark is leading, really challenge that narrative. And we need that to be challenged again and again and again. And I love Dr. Vidi's notion of holding ourselves accountable to the lawsuit and always looking back at it as a guide and a standard that we never want to return to, that we always want to be pushing forward. And I think that relates to another question that I know you'll be asking, Christine, about how we move forward in this time.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Rosenbaum, what are your thoughts about the legacy of this lawsuit? And perhaps building on Dean Moji's comments, there's both a legal legacy and a social legacy for it, right?
Exactly right. I mean, I think there is the legal legacy has been discussed, and as I said, this case is being utilized in other cases, in other conversations around the country. There has been some practical, some real change as a result of lawsuit, though, as Dr. Beatty said, nowhere what's required. But I think the real power and the real legacy of this case is that you get to know people like Jamaria Hall, and that you get to be part of that struggle. As I said, and as Jamaria said eloquently, this is a struggle that didn't begin 3 years ago. This is the story of the struggle against racist policies at the core, to attempt to dismantle education as a way of attempting to subordinate. But the legacy is to those who join in this struggle, and I'm so pleased to be speaking to this audience, because we wouldn't have been where we were without brave social scientists who put their research to work on behalf of these movements. I'm so privileged to be part of that process. But we're all privileged to be able to know individuals like Jamaria, to know individuals like his family, to talk to the Mama Moores of Detroit, who were contemporaries of Rosa Parks, and to realize this is not a Detroit struggle. This is an American struggle to see if we're really serious. And I think that's the legacy. And whatever the limitations of what the results are, this was a victory, and it was a victory for those who took on power and who beat the hell out of them, who they thought they had it. They thought they could use emergency managers, the Betsy DeVosses, and those who work with them thought that they could take apart these communities, and these communities took apart them. I think that is the greatest legacy, that fight continues, and it's going to continue to go forward, and it's going to continue to prevail. And all of us are going to have an opportunity, which is the opportunity of our lives, to line up with the Nikolai Vitis and the Jamaria Halls of this country. And there is no better way to live a life.
Mr. Hall, what about you? You have a perspective on this case that none of the rest of us do. I'm curious about your thoughts about its legacy. What difference will this case make?
The legacy really starts now. It starts after the war, because we were in a war on the demise of public education, driven on the interests of private companies that weren't from the city or weren't within the city. I mean, Detroit, or just us as a whole. I mean, once we're given the opportunity, I mean, that's what this whole fight was for. It's a cry out for help. It's a roar out to be heard, to feel like someone, to know, okay, we're supposed to vote, or we're supposed to stand up and go to city hall meetings. But what about when all these things aren't working? What is our next resort? How will we get through this time? Because, I mean, like I said, the legacy starts. We haven't seen a literate nation. I mean, we haven't, in Detroit, we've never had the most up-to-date resources, but we've always had one of the most proficient grades and proficient levels before these times. So just knowing that we have so much capability, so much potential inside of us, and so much power that is just waiting to be released throughout an opportunity of not even just resources, or we don't even want equality, just an opportunity to not be oppressed, to not have to worry about what's going on in our communities, in our lives, and also dealing with 10 times worse in our schools, the place that is supposed to bring us up and help uplift us. And I think most of all, though, we all came out with a resemblance of students matter. Students' voices matter a lot. So just building curriculum that students are a part of and are looked at as capable learners and not deficient students, or just young people. Let them understand and know what's going on around them, how they're being affected, and how they can speak out. I mean, my teachers and our teachers were having us write out to Governor Snyder before the lawsuit. So just giving us the powers that we can use as citizens in the United States of America, because we don't need any handouts. We just need the opportunity.
Thank you again. And your comments really bring us back to the present moment, but also looking forward. And so I'd like our panelists to look forward as well, because we've been in the midst of a global pandemic for about a year now. with significant learning loss occurring and also challenges to that narrative. And so, especially with the increased challenges of the current situation, how do we avoid ending up back where we began? So what's happening? What comes next? What should be coming next? Dr. Vitti, well, we'd like to start with you for this one.
Sure. So, even when you look at the impact that the pandemic has had on the world, and let's take it to the context of, our country, the state, and the city, we see yet again, examples of the history of racism in this country. You see the disproportionate death rate in the Black community because of COVID. You see, when we close schools, you see the magnification of the digital divide with students that didn't have tablets and internet access to learn from home. Curriculum that was not able to easily shift from a traditional textbook in the classroom to a laptop. And then once we move forward with online learning, you then started to see those divides as far as what was happening at home. No fault of individual children or families, but because of the history of race in this country, you have big divides on educational attainment, which saw itself with being able to help children at home. You saw socioeconomic challenges with who had to go back to work and who could stay at home. You saw flexibility with work schedules, children having to say, well, I got to go to work. I can't learn from home because I got to make sure that we got enough money to stay in our house and not be evicted or, pay for electricity. So then you start to see the divide in attendance, engagement, grades, failure rate. So here we go. You see that already in normal school settings, and now it's just exacerbated in a pandemic. So I will say that, for the first time, I talked about history and before, for the first time in my professional history, and the first time that I can recall, the federal government through, new President Biden and Congress for the first time have actually implemented an equitable funding strategy regarding this pandemic. And so there is a disproportionate of resources going to districts like Detroit to attack the same issues that I just outlined because of the pandemic. And we go back to feeling supported. And I, from a financial point of view, unfortunately, I can't say that with our state legislature, but I can say that with the federal government right now. But it was democracy in action to elect a new president, to elect a Congress that was more sensitive to the plight of the urban core, to Black and Brown America. And you're seeing that with resources. So, it's great to talk about equity. It's great to talk about Black Lives Matters, but what are you actually doing? And the president and the Congress have actually done something. And now I feel that as superintendent, we have the resources to do things differently and better. We can now do more home visits. We can now go deeper with transportation, with vans to pick kids up if they missed the initial bus. We can do more summer school. We can redo HVAC systems or run summer school, in the summer at all schools, not just 40 out of 106. We can lower class size. We can hire more teachers. All the things that we know are best practices that we can't do because of equitable funding. Now, I will say my excitement has to be tempered by the fact that this is one-time money. We spend it, it's gone. So, but at least for the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to be able to attack some of the issues that we haven't been able to attack. And I'm optimistic because I know what our students can do. If we give them the right resource, we give them the right support, we have the right expectation. So I'm looking forward to the next 3 years being able to show increases in student achievement, increases in attendance, decreases in chronic absenteeism, increases in graduation rate, increases in college readiness rates. We're ready. And I think In the next 3 years, we're going to have a body of work with data connected to it so that we then go to the legislature and say, see what happens when there's equitable funding. You know, our students respond. And so that's what I look forward to. A lot of work to do, but I'm optimistic. And, you know, I was able to visit a couple schools, and having kids back in school is the only fuel I need to just keep on going, because they're ready, they're eager. And, you know, you can see the difference between our kindergartners and our 12th graders. And that's because of what happens to them over the years when they're not given what they deserve.
So Mr. Rosenbaum, same question to you. What's happening? What should be happening? What comes next?
Well, I think we have to keep fighting. I think until access to literacy is a right recognized in every community, we shouldn't have to go to legislatures and plead for what Dr. Vitti just described. It's a basic right of every child in this country. And until this country treats it as such, then there'll never be any semblance of a democracy. And we have to take it for what it is. And that's the way it's desired. I also think we have to expand it, because part of literacy, part of an access to literacy is a recognition that any sound and basic education has got to be anti-racist, that we have to teach anti-racism, at least at the same time we're teaching about the fall of the Roman Empire. There isn't a more important curriculum. There isn't a more important mission. That's what we look to the schools for. Brown versus the Board of Education was an education case, but it was a race case. And it talked about the role of schools in inculcating basic values. Look, until we say that every education has to be anti-racist, which, as I said, includes making sure that all children have the opportunity to become literate, but more than that, that they see themselves in the histories that they study, that they learn from teachers of all sorts of backgrounds, that they don't have communities like in New York City, where the so-called specialized schools have 895 students like Stuyvesant and only 7 Black kids, where children are not told as they are to put the pros and cons of slavery on a board. Until we recognize that is part and parcel of every child's birthright as well, then the struggle has to continue. We can win this, and we will win it, because the soldiers and the generals in this battle are the Jamari A. Halls and the Nikolai Vittis, but we've got to commit ourselves to it. If we love our children, then you have to love all children, and that's really what this is all about.
Thank you. Dean Moji, what comes next?
Well, thanks, Christine. And Christine, I want to thank you particularly for mentioning the kind of pushback on the learning loss narrative. I think we have to be really cautious about the idea that there is learning loss, because we know that not everyone has lost opportunity to learn equally. Again, more privileged school districts and more privileged families were able to push in all kinds of learning opportunities for students. So that's one piece that I want to highlight in pushing on the learning loss discourse. But I also want to push back on any kind of language around children being behind. And I want to borrow from Dr. Vitti's language of students first. The children aren't behind. We set the standards. We're the adults. We decide what the bar is. And so it's actually our society that's behind. It's our systems that are behind. And so if we can really think very carefully about what it means to serve children well, and not leave them behind, as opposed to putting the onus on the children, and the learner, I think that will be really important. I do think that opportunities to learn for many children were lost, or at least were were, not available. And so we have to double down on that. And I can kind of think of it in two ways. One, we have to create opportunities for equitable learning, right? So equitable opportunities. And then we have to double down on navigating the discourse that doesn't further exacerbate the gaps that we see play out. So I have four things that I think we should be thinking about. One is that digital divide that Dr. Vitti mentioned. That digital divide has been there forever. And yet we used to hear all schools are wired, everyone has access, everyone has a smartphone, but that access has always been differential. And we need to really push in on that, think carefully about what we're going to do, make sure that communities aren't redlined, that they actually do have access to broadband and to all the kinds of resources that we need. Where the money comes from for that, I'm with Dr. Vitti on that one. These one-time funds, will they carry forward? A second area is summer learning, and I have both a concern and a hope in the summer learning realm. I'm concerned that some children will be forced to sit in classrooms doing skill drills in the name of learning loss, in the name of catching up. And I think we have to really work on how we're going to be creative about really equitable access to robust learning, not to pablum, right? My hope is that this might be a moment where we start thinking about more balanced calendars, distributing learning time across the calendar year, as opposed to, these big chunks of time and big gaps of time. We've always had summer learning loss. Maybe this is a moment to change that. I hope that we can push in some work on teacher professional development, particularly in the area of trauma-informed practice and socio-emotional learning. Children are going to be coming back to school with a lot of needs that transcend the academic, and that will shape their access to learning, literacy, math, whatever. And so I really hope we can figure that out. And I know there's great work being done in Detroit Public Schools Community District. I hope that we can see that around the state. And then finally, Mark stole my thunder. I just want to underscore that all of this work is anti-racism work. We have to work on that. It has to be the thread that flows through any move we make. And we've always got to put that in the front, because that is the root cause of the inequities that we see. Thank you.
Thanks. Our last question goes to Mr. Hall, and in a way it's the same question, but I'd like to frame it a bit differently. So Mr. Hall, this case was about the opportunities that you and other students should have had but didn't. And I understand that your involvement in this case has led you and some of the other plaintiffs to become involved in advocacy work. So could you tell us a bit about this, again, with a focus on what comes next and where you're putting your energy?
Yes, really, just to kind of rebuttal what Mudge just kind of spoke on, just the importance of student engagement, especially throughout the summer and with the teacher professional development. I would like to partner with schools such as Michigan State, schools such as Michigan University, schools such as University of Detroit, to kind of host a professional development kind of case for about a week or 2 weeks, that the students and teachers can kind of learn new steps and new priorities and kind of really get to know each other. I know that's the only way we're going to really know or develop trauma, or to really be able to deal with the students and to know what's going on if we know them personally. So kind of getting that base of students and teachers in the realm of building also a peer to teacher development, to where that the peers can be teachers in the classrooms and teach their peers. And also I'm working on an app to where the students can get paid to learn and also be mentors on the app, that I will hope will also grow the student to teacher pipeline, so that more students will look at education and teaching such as not just something that is a necessity or that they're obligated to do, but something that I know Mr. Vitti just spoke on that too, that to where now I do have obligation of money, or I have things going on, so that this is covering multiple needs, and just bringing in joyful practices, looking at education as a safe, fun learning tool, instead of it being such a drill and kill try to test standardization type thing. So just trying to work, and like you said, just advocating and working with people and bringing in new ideas, working with organizations. I'm currently here in Miami, Florida, working with some of the organizations to kind of get things down. So this, like Mark said, the fight continues. So I'm also a big part of that fight, and just kind of guiding students, because they oftentimes we say the students are the future, but they are the present. I mean, especially when we're going through a time like this, to where this is a pandemic that we never would have imagined, and that we have these cures that are coming out just because we don't have a cure. So we're looking at the first thing or the first option, because we're so uneducated as a world right now, that we aren't even producing students that can evolve and adapt to situations such as these.
Thank you. It's great to hear about the things that you're working on currently, and I have no doubt that we will hear great things about you for many years to come. So that is all of the time that we have, and I am so grateful to each of the panelists for their time, their contributions, and this very rich discussion about incredibly complex issues. I hope everyone joining us today has learned as much in this conversation as I have. That's all for today, and have a good night. Thank you for joining us.